After the Prophet Muhammad's victory over the Quraysh Meccans at the Battle of Badr, the Meccan leadership had been decimated. With the execution of Amr ibn Hisham and the loss of many tribal leaders, the disastrous news came as a shock to Abu Sufyan, but the old chiefs were soon replaced by their inexperienced sons, leaving Sufyan the only Quraysh leader of notable stature to direct civil and military affairs within the city. Before, the older leadership had been reluctant to use force against Muhammad, but with the devastating Meccan defeat at Badr, the mood in Mecca changed drastically. Many Meccans now believed Muhammad could only be dealt with by force, and within a month after Badr, a Meccan raiding party had been assembled of around 150-200 men under Abu Sufyan's personal command to undertake a raid against Medina. The Meccans now regarded Muhammad as their archenemy. In April 624, Abu Sufyan's raiders approached Medina. Following traditional Arab tactics, they made ready to attack in the early morning, switching from camels to horses. Details on the raid are scarce, but it seems that it turned into a minor skirmish with only a few workers caught, tending the fields killed, and 2 houses burned before the Meccan raiders withdrew. After some time, Muhammad gathered a response force and chased after the raiders. The entire affair is known derisively by Muslim chronicles as the Porridge Raid, since during their escape from Muhammad, the Meccans jettisoned some of their baggage, including several sacks of dried barley used for making porridge. Muhammad soon broke off his pursuit, having given chase mostly to save face and not to engage the Meccans. The following month, Muhammad sought to capitalize off his victory at Badr by assembling a force of up to 450 men and leading raids against 2 Bedouin tribes, the Ghatafan and the Beni Sulaim. While no large-scale fighting took place, Muhammad's strategy became clear. His aim was to strangle and isolate Mecca economically and politically by depriving it of its much-needed Bedouin allies for safe caravan passage. In late January 625, an army of 3,000 men and 200 horses made up of the Quraysh, an assembly of Bedouin client tribes, and some Abyssinian mercenaries marched out of Mecca toward Medina, determined to bring the war to Muhammad's doorstep. They took 12 days to reach the outskirts of Medina, with their route of march taking them west of the city and then north, where they camped at a place known as the 2 Springs on an open plain at the foot of a rocky outcropping called Mount Uhud. Terrain had made the direct approach to Medina from the south impossible, since the city is situated on a lava plain about 10 miles wide and 10 miles long, surrounded on 3 sides by steep mountains. Medina could only be approached from the north over open ground free of obstacles. The Meccan army went into camp just north of the foot of Mount Uhud, but their arrival was no secret, and Muhammad immediately dispatched Muslim scouts to maintain watch over the enemy army. He called for a general mobilization to meet the threat, and about 1,000 men were mustered for duty. Muhammad knew he was greatly outnumbered. Additionally, giving battle on an open plain would relinquish the advantage to the Meccans. Worse, the Muslims had no cavalry, while the Meccans had 200 horsemen under the command of Khalid ibn al-Walid and Ikrimah ibn Abu Jahl, later to become 2 of the most famous Muslim generals in the early Islamic conquests. Muhammad assembled a war council to seek advice. As always, the Prophet was disposed to the defense and wanted to draw the enemy army into Medina itself in urban, house-to-house fighting. In this argument, he was supported by Abdullah ibn Ubay, the chief of the Khazraj and an experienced warrior, who was also in favor of fighting it out in the streets. Their argument was sound. The palm groves, springs, walled gardens, and the fortified compounds with their towers made it difficult for the Meccans to bring their superior numbers to bear on the Muslims. The terrain and obstacles would break up any Meccan unit cohesion, making them vulnerable to ambush and piecemeal engagements by the Muslims, defeating them in detail. The Meccans also had no siege weaponry, so if the Muslims withdrew into their compounds and refused to give battle, the Meccan army, lacking any supply trains, would be forced to abandon their position after the crops in their field were all used up. However, a large crowd had gathered, some wanting to fight in the city, while many wanted to fight in the open. Muhammad finally decided on a pitched battle. He donned his armor and retrieved his weapons, and ordered the men to muster near the cul-de-sac at the foot of Mount Uhud. However, Ibn Ubay strongly opposed Muhammad's decision to offer battle in the open plain instead of engaging in urban combat in the streets of Medina. He withdrew his contingent of Khazraj tribesmen, about 300 men, a third of Muhammad's army, and rode back to Medina. The rest of the host pressed onto Mount Uhud, Upon the arrival of the Meccans, Muhammad ordered a skirmish line to be thrown out across the northern approaches, and nightly patrols conducted to warn of enemy activity. Muhammad then surrounded himself with a bodyguard of 50 chosen men. With the withdrawal of Ibn Ubay's troops, Muhammad had only 700 troops on hand to combat the Meccans. Of these, only 100 were equipped in mail armor. Across the pending battlefield, the Meccan cavalry had deployed in a somewhat unorthodox manner. One troop contingent under the command of Ikrimah ibn Abu Jahl was deployed forward of the main Meccan infantry line and was likely intended to skirmish with the Muslim front line using their lances from horseback. The more serious threat to Muhammad's position was the 2nd Cavalry Troop, probably larger, commanded by Khalid ibn al-Walid and deployed far to the right of the Meccan infantry line. His mission was to turn Muhammad's flank. The terrain to Muhammad's left was broken by palm groves and walled gardens, but this was insufficient to prevent a movement in formation by al-Walid's cavalry. To prevent the Meccan horsemen from turning his flank, Muhammad posted 50 archers on the Ainain Hill, hereafter called the Hill of Arrows in Muslim chronicles. Muhammad reviewed his troops on horseback and then moved them into position on the battlefield. Sources don't specify the exact time of the start of the Battle of Uhud on March 23rd, 625, but it can be assumed that it likely started in the late morning or early afternoon. The two lines of infantry drew closer to one another, and the battle began, when a Meccan warrior stepped forward challenging the Muslims to send forth a champion to come forth and meet him in individual combat. Ali rushed from the Muslim ranks, attacked the Meccan, and killed him with a single slash of his sword. A single chant of Allah Akbar rose from the Muslim ranks. The brother of the slain warrior rushed from the Meccan ranks to attack his brother's killer. Before he could reach Ali, the fierce Hamza stepped forward between them and cut the assailant down. 3 more men from the Meccan line challenged Hamza, one after another. All 3 met their deaths at the end of his blade. Excited by the vigorous single combats taking place before them, the Muslim ranks charged the Meccans, engaging them in fierce hand-to-hand combat. The wounded were slain without mercy. As the battle raged between the infantry, a Muslim soldier named Abu Dujana cut his way through the enemy ranks before reaching the Meccan camp. He then scattered the Meccan female camp followers as he rushed headlong into the encampment. Meanwhile, Hamza seems to not have taken part in the charge, but prowled the battlefield looking for Meccan warriors to fight. Little did he know that Washi, a hired slave mercenary, was also looking for him. He was hired by Hind, the daughter of Utaba ibn Rabia, who had been killed by Hamza in the Battle of Badr, and now she wanted revenge, as Hamza engaged another Meccan champion. Washi found him, threw his javelin, and pierced right through his body. Hamza charged Washi, but before he could reach him, he collapsed to the ground. Washi retrieved his javelin and proceeded to walk off the battlefield. Having no further business there, the ferocity of the Muslim attack succeeded in breaking the Meccan line at several points, permitting groups of Muslim soldiers to penetrate and begin isolating segments of the Meccan ranks, hacking them to pieces. For a while, their superior numbers allowed the Meccans to hold on to their position. Eventually, however, they began to waver and fall back in a semi-disciplined fashion. It was at this point that the Muslims pressed the attack with great force and ferocity, penetrating through the Meccan ranks until the enemy was cut off from their camp, with Muslim soldiers behind them, and in the midst of their ranks, the Meccan defense collapsed once more. Muhammad's disciplined infantry had proven that a smaller, highly motivated force could defeat a larger, less motivated force in close combat. Had the Muslims even had a small cavalry contingent with which to pursue and scatter the routed Meccans, the Battle of Uhud would have been a complete disaster for the enemy army. But the Meccan cavalry, commanded by Khalid ibn al-Walid, had still not engaged in the fighting. Khalid hovered near the flanks, moving his mounted contingent about and waiting for the right time to strike. It was at this time that the Meccan infantry broke and fled, exposing their camp. The Muslim attack subsequently lost momentum, as the soldiers abandoned the fight to plunder the camp. Many of the archers guarding the Hill of Arrows also joined in the looting, with only a handful remaining at their post. Al-Walid, seeing most of the archers leaving to plunder the Meccan camp, rallied his cavalry and led it at full gallop through the now unprotected gap. Khalid led the horsemen from the front as they turned Muhammad's flank and struck his forces in the rear. 200 Meccan cavalry punched right through the enemy infantry and continued riding, readying themselves to wheel about and strike again. Attempting to regroup along the line of departure, the Muslims broke off their looting and turned around. This provided breathing room for the Meccans to reform and return the attack. Khalid ibn al-Walid continued to wreak havoc. Behind the Muslim positions, his horsemen riding about the rear, striking targets of opportunity with their long lances. The Muslim infantry began to lose its cohesion and flee, with their formations collapsing entirely. Events went from bad to worse. Muhammad and his bodyguard were now surrounded by Meccan troops pressing the attack with great force. As the din of combat swirled around the Prophet, he was struck in the face with a sling stone that shattered one of his teeth and cut his lip and cheek, and received a sword blow on his helmet, the force of the impact knocking him off. His feet, around him, his bodyguards were being cut to pieces. The Meccans closed in on Muhammad's position. Seeing this, the Prophet's standard-bearer, Mus'ab ibn Umayr, raised his flag and shouted the takbir to divert the enemy's attention to himself. Mus'ab fought valiantly but was cut down. Suddenly, the rumor swept the battlefield that Muhammad had been killed. A cheer rose among the Meccans, but they mistook Mus'ab for Muhammad, both of whom wore similar battle armor. News of the Prophet's death brought the Battle of Uhud to an end, with the Meccans breaking off their attack in celebration. Meanwhile, Muhammad, dazed from the blow he received, was safe under a pile of bodies protected by a few stalwart Muslim warriors. Muhammad and his followers later buried their dead on the battlefield and returned to Medina that night. The Battle of Uhud may have seemed like a major defeat for Muhammad's Muslim army, but Abu Sufyan's Meccan army failed to follow up the scattering of Muslim forces and take Medina. He soon had the Meccan army riding home, believing they had won, and that Muhammad was dead. 2 days after the battle, Muhammad ordered the remnants of his army to assemble back at Medina. The Battle of Uhud was a setback for the Muslim cause, but Muhammad had not been killed and Medina had survived. He and his men lived to fight another day.